Imagine walking alone on a cold night, heading toward a place where the shadows seem to have a life of their own. A cemetery that doesn't just house the dead, but swallows them, taking those who dare approach to a dark, eternal fate. Lucas, a curious young man, made the fateful choice to enter this cursed place, and what happened next changed his life forever. What he discovered, however, was much more than he could ever have imagined. In this video, we will explore Lucas's journey, a terrifying tale of despair and horror in the cemetery, where the dead never rest and the shadows are always lurking. With every step he took, the cemetery's dark presence consumed him further, until he became part of something much more sinister than a mere ghost story. Leave a like, because this is just the beginning of a story that will send chills down your spine. Follow every detail, because in this world, nothing is as it seems. Would you dare enter this cemetery? Or would it be wiser to stay far away, knowing the shadows might follow you home?
The night was dark, almost starless, and a chilling breeze swept through the small town. The cemetery, located in the heart of the village, appeared even more sinister at that moment. The gravestones, weathered over time by the dampness, stood like silent sentinels over forgotten graves. The wind whispered through the tall trees, causing the branches to sway in a strange manner, as though they were skeletal hands trying to reach the sky. The silence, interrupted only by the rustling of dry leaves, enveloped the place in a shroud of mystery and unease. As the biting breeze blew, a sense of discomfort spread through the air, as if something were lurking in the shadows, watching every movement. The old tombstones seemed more than mere markers of memory. They seemed to hide forgotten secrets, untold stories, or perhaps lost souls still wandering that sacred ground. The cemetery, which during the day seemed like a peaceful place, now exuded a feeling of fear, a foreboding sense that, in this place, the living and the dead blurred into an eternal dance. With every step, the sound of one's feet on the ground seemed amplified, and breathing became more difficult, as if the air was laden with something heavy and unbearable. It was as though the night itself had a life of its own, with its own mysteries and hidden intentions. In that desolate scene, the cemetery was not just a resting place, but a fragile border between what is known and what should never be discovered. There were rumors that the cemetery was cursed. Some said that the dead buried there did not rest in peace, their souls condemned to wander eternally between the shadows, trapped in a cycle of suffering and torment. Nights, especially, were darker, and the wind passing through the cold stones seemed to carry the whispers of restless souls, muffled screams from times gone by, but still present, as though the cemetery itself held secrets that should never be revealed. Others, bolder, told stories of supernatural encounters, of dark figures appearing among the tombstones, of voices calling the living by name, and of a cold, indescribable presence approaching those who dared enter the place at night. Some claimed to have seen pale shapes between the gravestones, while others swore their lanterns suddenly went out, as if something were preventing the light from touching that dark place. But no one ever dared to prove the truth of these accounts, fearing that by attempting to debunk the mysteries, they might become part of the very curse that hung over the cemetery. Over time, the entire village began to avoid the place, preferring not to speak of it, as if merely mentioning it could attract something bad. The older generations whispered among themselves, warning the young not to venture into that forgotten land, where the dead seemed more alive than ever. And so, the cemetery remained, a living legend, waiting for those willing to challenge fear. But perhaps deep down, knowing that the true terror was not in the stories told, but in what no one dared admit, that perhaps it was not just a story. In the dead of night, when the town clock struck midnight, the wind blew forcefully, causing the trees to sway as if they were alive. Their branches crackled and twisted in the dark. The sky, covered by heavy clouds, seemed to swallow all the light from the stars, plunging the town into a dense and oppressive darkness. Amid the sepulchral silence, a single sound cut through the air, the crackling of dry leaves dragging across the ground as if someone were walking unseen, moving with a supernatural caution, calculating every step. The sound of the leaves was unmistakable, soft yet unsettling, like a warning that something was about to happen. The wind, now stronger, carried with it a cold that made the body tremble, and the sound of the leaves blended with the rustling of the trees, creating a ghostly melody that seemed to come from every direction. The feeling of being watched grew with every moment, as if something or someone was approaching, yet no one could see or hear what was about to be revealed. The deserted streets of the town were immersed in an air of expectation, as if the night itself knew that something was about to break the veil of silence. Every shadow cast by the few street lamps seemed to hide ancient and forgotten secrets. And in the midst of that desolate scene, the sound of dry leaves continued, growing ever closer, as if the invisible entity was approaching someone or something. Who would be the next to hear the steps of that silent yet unsettling being slinking through the darkness, leaving no trace? But it wasn't just the wind that caused the sense of something strange. The gravestones, with their worn shapes and moss-covered surfaces, had something peculiar, as if they carried an invisible presence, a dense and oppressive energy that seemed to intensify with every step taken toward those stone relics. It was as if, as one got closer, the air grew heavier, breathing became more difficult, and the very sounds around seemed muffled, distant, as if the world outside was being swallowed by the atmosphere of that place. There was something in the stones that transcended the simple gravity of mourning. Each inscription, each carved name, seemed to pulse with a memory that would not fade, with a force that defied time. As if the souls resting there were not truly at peace, but bound to those stone marks, enslaved to the ground that buried them. The silence hanging over the cemetery was not absolute. It was laden with murmurs, with imperceptible whispers, as if the gravestones themselves were trying to tell something, but their voices were lost in the cracks of their surfaces, in the fissures of time. Each gravestone seemed to watch, each stone seemed to hold dark secrets, as if the soil in which they were buried was not sacred, but rather a prison, a limbo, where the souls, restless, became part of the very landscape. The weight of the past seemed to condense in that space, and with it came the sense that this cemetery was not just a place for the dead, but a space where the living were also prisoners, marked by the shadow, watching them from within the gravestones. That environment, filled with mystery and an indescribable feeling that something was about to happen, left no doubt that perhaps the souls buried there still wandered, not to rest, but to observe, to wait. And anyone who dared to take another step toward those stones would likely lose themselves in the lingering feeling that the very air around him had become thick with an unseen presence. The atmosphere seemed to press down on him, heavy and suffocating, as though the cemetery itself were alive, watching his every move. His heart began to race, the chill seeping deeper into his bones, but his curiosity pushed him forward, compelling him to continue, despite the mounting fear. As he moved deeper into the cemetery, the rustling of the leaves grew louder, as though they were reacting to his presence. He glanced around, but nothing seemed to stir except for the eerie motion of the trees swaying in the wind. Yet, there was something more, something subtle but unmistakable, lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. When he reached the far corner of the cemetery, the old weathered gravestones seemed to take on an almost menacing quality, their chipped surfaces glowing faintly in the light of his lantern. The feeling of being watched intensified, the silence pressing in like a physical force. His breath quickened, and his footsteps faltered. It was as though something, or someone, was drawing closer, just out of sight, yet undeniably near. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air. The wind picked up again, howling now, sending a cascade of leaves tumbling through the night. Lucas froze, his senses on high alert, but there was no mistaking the sound of something, or someone, moving behind him. His skin prickled with fear, and he turned but saw nothing. Only the endless rows of gravestones, silent and unmoving. Just as he was about to dismiss it as his imagination playing tricks on him, the low murmur of whispers filled the air. Faint at first, like the distant echoes of voices, but growing clearer with each passing moment. The whispers seemed to surround him, closing in from all sides, carrying with them a chilling sense of dread. His pulse quickened, and he found himself unable to move, caught in the grip of some unseen force that held him in place. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow flitting between the gravestones. It was gone in an instant, but the flicker of movement left a mark on his mind, A cold, invisible hand seemed to clutch at his chest, and he stumbled backward, the light from his lantern trembling violently in his grasp. In that moment, Lucas realized that the rumors, the stories of restless souls and supernatural presences, were not just tales. They were warnings, and as the whispers grew louder, he understood that the cemetery held more than just the remains of the dead. It held the weight of memories, of lost souls trapped between the past and the present. He wasn't alone. With a sudden burst of energy, Lucas turned and fled, his heart pounding in his ears, the whispering voices now a chorus of frantic, inaudible pleas. The gate loomed ahead, and as he reached it, he felt a cold hand brush his shoulder, sending him into a panic as he wrenched open the gate and stumbled into the street beyond. He didn't stop running until he was far away from the cemetery, his breath ragged and his mind racing. The stories had been true, and what he had felt in that dark place was not of this world. The shadows he had glimpsed between the gravestones were not simply remnants of the past. They were a living, breathing presence, watching, waiting. And as he looked back toward the cemetery from the safety of the town, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps he had not truly left. Perhaps the spirits that lingered there were not so easily left behind, and they would always watch, always whisper, and always wait for the next soul daring enough to enter their domain. Something more, a palpable feeling that he was not alone there. His eyes scanned the scene, but everything seemed the same. The stillness, the heavy silence. However, a shiver ran down his spine, and the impression of being watched only grew stronger. The wind, which had once seemed to bring relief, now seemed to whisper his name, almost inaudible, but clear enough for him to stop and look around, trying to locate the source of the sound. His steps faltered. With every movement, the pressure of the environment became more unbearable, and the lantern trembled in his hand, as if it could sense the same apprehension he felt. The discomfort grew, and the reality around him seemed to distort. The graves were not merely burying bodies, but perhaps holding much darker secrets. It was as if the cemetery were a living entity, breathing and waiting for something, or someone. And in the silence, among the shadows and the whispers he couldn't understand, Lucas knew he had crossed an invisible line. Whatever was there, lurking, was not something he should have sought out. He approached a forgotten grave, situated deep within the cemetery, where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed. The ground was piled unevenly, as if something, or someone, had hurriedly tried to cover up what had been removed. A strange sensation enveloped him, something almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, as if something were trying to get his attention. His instincts warned him of imminent danger, but he couldn't shake the impulse to investigate. Cautiously, he crouched beside the grave, the cold, damp soil pressing against his knees. The lantern flickered in his hand, illuminating only fragments of what seemed like a forgotten story. A faded inscription he couldn't quite make out. However, it was the feeling that disturbed him the most. He felt as though he were being watched, but there was no one around. With each passing second, the tension mounted, and the air around him grew denser, as though an invisible pressure were overtaking his body. It was then, suddenly, that he felt something cold touch his skin. The sensation was sudden, like a chill running through his bones. His hairs stood on end, and his heart raced, but the worst was yet to come. The cold around him seemed to intensify, as though he were being surrounded by something invisible, something he couldn't see, but that was there, drawing closer, almost touching him. The sound of the wind, which had been his only companion that night, now seemed to fall silent, replaced by a deep, oppressive quiet, where even his own thoughts felt distorted. The feeling of being surrounded, trapped in an invisible circle, grew stronger. He quickly looked around, but the cemetery remained empty, the usual gravestones, still and silent. But somehow, he knew that this wasn't normal, that this place was hiding something that shouldn't be disturbed. Before he could take another step, the sound of a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, moved through the air, coming from the direction of the grave. Something was waking, something that had been dormant for so long, and Lucas knew, deep in his soul, that he should never have approached that forgotten grave. The lantern flickered briefly, its faint light wavering like a flame about to extinguish, before going out completely, plunging him into total darkness. The world around him became an immense void, where even the air seemed dense and heavy, as if the night itself had weight. The silence was absolute, overwhelming, and for a moment, Lucas felt small, insignificant, lost in the vastness of that unsettling stillness. But then, suddenly, he heard something. At first, it was an almost imperceptible sound, a distant murmur that could easily be ignored. However, as the silence stretched on, the voices became clearer, more present, as if they were rising from the very ground beneath his feet. A low, distorted whisper, punctuated by pauses and hissing sounds, as if the words were not meant to be spoken by human mouths. The voices seemed to flow from beyond, a distant echo, yet also terribly close, as if they were trying to communicate with him. The sound seemed to emanate from all sides, distorting and curling around Lucas, enveloping him in a cloak of foreboding. He tried to move the lantern, but his hands trembled so much that he could barely hold onto it. The sound intensified with each passing second, as if the voices were trying to invade his mind, dragging his thoughts into a dark and unknown place. Lucas. The whisper was clear, sharp, and his name sounded with a tone he didn't recognize, a voice that could not have come from any human being. His breath caught in his throat, his muscles stiffened, as if an invisible force were preventing him from moving. He knew he was not alone, but at the same time, he couldn't see anything. Only the darkness, only the silence, now filled with those threatening whispers that intertwined and multiplied, as if the cemetery itself were trying to speak to him. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something much older and more powerful than him, overtook his body. With each breath, with each murmur, Lucas felt he was sinking deeper into that endless night, where time seemed to dissolve, and the shadows became more than just darkness. He wanted to scream, to run, but the words vanished in his throat, and his steps felt as if they weighed a ton. The whisper suddenly ceased, leaving him immersed in absolute silence once again, more oppressive than ever. But now he knew that the cemetery wouldn't let him leave so easily. Something had called him, something had touched his soul, and he didn't know if he would be able to escape the presence that, invisible, was still watching him, waiting. Fear began to take over Lucas, and his muscles tensed, every fiber of his body screaming to flee. But he was paralyzed. His heart pounded in his chest, as if it were the only living thing in that dark place. He tried to breathe deeply, but the air seemed thick, laden with an invisible presence that oppressed him, as if the entire cemetery was exhaling an incomprehensible, malevolent power. With trembling hands, he stood up, his body heavy, as though gravity had intensified. The lantern, his only source of light, was still in his hand, but he knew he needed to turn it on again. He tried to twist the knob, press the base, but nothing worked. The lantern, once so reliable, was now just a useless piece of metal, glass, ignoring his desperate efforts. Fear consumed him more with each passing second, and he felt a cold chill run down his spine. The wind, which had previously seemed distant, increased in intensity, cutting through the night with its howl. The trees surrounding the cemetery shook violently, their branches swaying as if they had a life of their own, and the shadows began to move around him. They were not ordinary shadows. They were shapes that stretched and twisted erratically, as if the cemetery itself were alive, reorganizing around him, creating a labyrinth of darkness that surrounded him on all sides. Lucas blinked, trying to process what he was seeing, but the shadows seemed to have a will of their own, as if they were gradually but inevitably closing in. The sound of the wind mixed with the muffled murmurs of dry leaves dancing on the ground, creating a distorted, almost hypnotic melody, while he struggled to maintain his sanity. Every movement he made was slowly followed by a distant whisper, interwoven with the others, until it became an unsettling cacophony. It was as if the cemetery itself was calling to him, a subterranean voice rising from deep within the earth, from where the dead were buried. Panic began to spread, and Lucas, not knowing what to do, took a step back, trying to flee from what he could not understand. But his steps led him nowhere. The darkness seemed to expand before him, and he found himself more and more trapped in the heart of the cemetery. The wind roared in his ears, and the shadows continued to close in, growing more tangible, until he felt as if there were no way out. Something was surrounding him, something he could not see but knew was there. waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And as he felt the presence intensifying around him, Lucas knew deep in his soul that this night would not end as he had imagined. The cemetery, with its living darkness, would not let him leave. In the corner of his vision, something moved, something tall and dark, with a figure that seemed to materialize from the thick fog that was beginning to form between the tombstones. The presence was dense, threatening, as if it were part of the cemetery itself, a manifestation of what the place had swallowed over the years. The figure had no defined shape, but its silhouette was unmistakable, a shadow that stretched and twisted, growing as it approached Lucas, as if it were feeding on the darkness around it. Lucas swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his breathing grew heavier, as if the air were being sucked from his lungs. The fear, cold and suffocating, spread through his body, causing his legs to wobble and the ground to tremble beneath his feet. His eyes, fixed on that indescribable presence, couldn't look away. Something inside him knew he couldn't stare at the figure for too long, but he couldn't move, as if he were being drawn to the creature, as if his mind were being dominated by the silent force emanating from that being. The wind suddenly ceased, and the silence returned, heavy and absolute, as if the world had stopped. The fog around the figure seemed thick, impenetrable, swallowing the last shadows of light that remained. The presence advanced slowly, without haste, but with an irresistible force, as if it were watching Lucas, waiting for the right moment to draw even closer. Every step he took, the figure followed, as if it were a shadow reflected in his soul, a reflection of the very fear he was trying to ignore. His body trembled, but he couldn't move. The sensation of being watched intensified with each passing second, as if his own thoughts were being read, analyzed, as if the creature knew exactly what he feared. The air around him was heavy, thick with something invisible, something that made him feel smaller, insignificant in the face of what was watching him. Lucas tried to scream, but his voice didn't come out. His lips moved, but the sound he wanted to make got lost in the vastness of the night. His eyes widened in desperation, and he took a step back, but his legs were weak, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to open up. The figure drew closer and closer until the distance between them became minimal, and Lucas knew, with absolute terror, that there was no way to escape. The creature, or whatever it was, finally stopped, its dense and relentless presence engulfing him entirely. Time seemed to stop. The entire cemetery seemed to have closed in on him, and the only thing left was the sensation that something very ancient and very powerful was about to take control of his soul. The murmurs grew louder, increasing in volume until they became a distorted chorus of voices, as if 1,000 whispers were echoing at the same time, cutting through the dense, heavy air of the night. And then, something else. A low laugh, almost imperceptible at first, but soon it transformed into something chilling, deep and grotesque, as if it had been drawn from a nightmare. The laugh didn't come from any visible being, but seemed to fill the space around Lucas, invading his mind, distorting his thoughts. And then the figure appeared, hooded and cloaked in black, as if made from the very darkness that surrounded them. It appeared before him without any visible movement, as if it had simply materialized out of the void. Its eyes shone with a supernatural intensity, a cold, penetrating light that seemed to pierce even the deepest recesses of his soul. Those eyes were not human. They were filled with an indescribable power, a force that came from a place beyond Lucas's comprehension. He knew without a doubt that he shouldn't look into them, but he couldn't look away. It was as if his will had been broken, as if he were unable to escape the hypnotic spell of those eyes, which stared at him relentlessly. "You shouldn't be here," said the figure in a cold, lifeless voice, its words sounding like the whisper of the wind passing through ancient graves, emotionless, inhuman. The words seemed to crawl through the air, freezing everything around Lucas, leaving him paralyzed, his body now heavier than ever. He wanted to speak, wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat, as if something invisible were choking him. The air was thick with an indescribable pressure, and the figure took a step forward, its presence now even more oppressive. The cemetery, which had seemed motionless before, now seemed to bend before it, as if the place itself acknowledged its authority. Lucas felt the panic grow in his chest, a primal, almost instinctual fear that made him want to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped, as if the entity had created an invisible prison around him, a prison of pure darkness and terror. The laugh continued, lower now, but still present, like an echo of death itself, reverberating in the walls of his brain. Lucas didn't know what the figure wanted, but something inside him, perhaps a premonition, told him that leaving this place alive would be impossible. The cemetery was no longer just a resting place for the dead, but a space where shadows took shape, where the abyss between the real and the supernatural was dissolving. And he knew, deep in his soul, that this night would mark him forever, that something in his soul was about to be taken, stolen by the presence before him. "You should never have come," the figure said again, its voice closer now, more imposing, as if whispering directly into his mind. Fear overtook Lucas with an overwhelming force, and his body turned to stone, immobilized by the sensation that something indescribable and malignant surrounded him. His feet felt glued to the ground, as if the earth itself was becoming part of him, binding him inescapably. Every attempt to move was in vain, as if an invisible weight kept him there, where the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The darkness, once just an absence of light, now seemed to have substance, as if the night itself were alive and closing in on him. The words of the figure echoed in his mind, repeating like a cold and cruel mantra. "You shouldn't be here." They intertwined with his thoughts, poisoning his mind with deep terror, as if each syllable was a reminder that he didn't belong in this world, that he was an intruder, a mortal in a space where the rules of life and death no longer applied. The voice of the figure continued to reverberate in his head, filling his brain with a dark and inescapable presence. He tried to scream, but his throat felt tight, and the words simply wouldn't come out. The sound he wanted to make got lost in his own mind, swallowed by the pressure that seemed to crush his being. His breath became irregular, gasping, as if the air was being stolen from him, each breath a desperate effort to fill lungs that could no longer expand. He tried to call for help, but the words never reached his lips. His voice failed him, tearing at his thoughts with a sense of even crueler impotence. Lucas was trapped, not by chains, but by something more subtle, more terrifying, as if something invisible had captured him, with ethereal hands that surrounded him without touch, without form. He couldn't see it, but he could feel the growing pressure, a force that seized his mind, his soul, dragging him to a place where time and space no longer made sense. He was in a limbo, where the rules of reality no longer applied, where he no longer belonged to this world. The cemetery, which had once seemed like nothing more than a resting place for the dead, now revealed itself as a place where shadows took form and the living. Lucas knew that if he didn't break free from his invisible prison, he would become part of yet another lost soul, another memory fading. The figure slowly approached, its steps almost imperceptible, but the pressure emanating from it increased with each movement. Lucas felt his chest tighten, as if an invisible force was crushing his lungs, preventing him from breathing. The air around him seemed to vanish, as though the very space was being sucked into an immense and endless void. He tried to draw in a breath, desperate, but all he could feel was an oppressive density that made even the simplest movement difficult. The cold, icy and cutting, enveloped his body so intensely, it felt like it was penetrating his bones, his flesh. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was as if the very heat of his life was being drained, ripped away from him by a force he could not understand. His extremities were going numb, and the touch of the freezing mist seemed to freeze his skin, making it impossible to feel his fingers or even his breath. He tried to break free, an instinctive reaction, but his hands were frozen, immobilized as if they had turned to stone. His fingers, once trembling, were now stiff and lifeless, incapable of moving or responding to any command from his mind. Panic consumed him, a wave of desperation that made his heart race, but his muscles, already heavy and weak, refused to respond. He was completely trapped, his hands inert, his arms paralyzed, as if some supernatural force had locked his will, his essence, in an invisible prison. The figure, now so close that Lucas could feel its weight in the air, stopped before him. Its eyes shone with a light that cut through the darkness, and the gaze it cast seemed to pierce Lucas, as if it could see into his soul. The creature didn't need to speak. Its presence was a sentence, a guarantee that he was at the mercy of that indescribable power. The fear was so profound, that he could barely comprehend what was happening. Everything seemed to collapse around him, and the cemetery, with its shadows and tombstones, now became a place of condemnation, where he was becoming part of something greater, something he could not understand. With each passing second, the feeling of being consumed by that force only intensified. He was trapped, not just physically, but in a way that defied logic. His body, his mind, his soul were all being taken over by something beyond his comprehension. And deep down, Lucas knew there was no turning back. With a Herculean effort, Lucas managed, against all odds, to break the paralysis that had held him captive. His body seemed to come back to life abruptly, and he took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The air, now dense and cold, cut at his skin like sharp blades, but he didn't care. Something inside him, a primal force of survival, pushed him away from the presence that terrified him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He ran. With each step, his feet hit the damp ground with force, but his spine seemed to be consumed by the cold, as if his bones were turning to ice. The wind cut across his face, and the sound of his breath blended with the echo of the laughter chasing him, low and distorted, like an echo from a nightmare. The hooded figure was behind him, still there. He knew it, even without needing to look. The laughter grew, becoming a tangible threat, a wave of mockery cutting through the night's silence like a sharp blade. The shadows around him stretched and twisted, as if they had a life of their own, reaching for him with cold, black arms. They danced on the periphery of his vision, taking the form of long, swaying hands, as if they wanted to grab him and pull him into the darkness. The cemetery, that place of the dead and mysteries, seemed to have transformed into a living trap, where the earth and the shadows united to swallow anyone who dared to enter. Lucas felt his legs begin to weaken, fear gnawing at his strength, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. He felt the warmth of his body dissipating, the cold consuming him, but the adrenaline pushed him forward, faster, more desperate. Each step felt like his last chance to escape, but the ground seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the cemetery were becoming a never-ending labyrinth. The laughter, now a grotesque cackle, reverberated in the wind, making his guts twist. The shadows followed him, closer with every second, and he could almost feel the invisible hands trying to grab him, pull him down, into the earth. He saw the graves around him distort, as if they were rising, moving, creating barriers to his escape. Panic blinded him, but he kept running, the bones of his spine still frozen, as if he were being chased by death itself. Finally, something changed. He saw ahead, an opening, a gap in the darkness, a distant street, a faint line of light on the horizon, where he knew the cemetery ended. But before he could reach it, the air grew thicker, denser, and the laughter grew louder, invading his mind like a deafening scream. He was no longer alone. The shadows had caught up to him, and the cemetery, with its hungry hands, was ready to swallow him. Lucas finally reached the edge of the cemetery, the distant horizon visible as a promise of freedom. His feet were tired, his lungs burning, but the sight of the street ahead, with its dim lights, gave him one last hope. He was almost there. The escape seemed possible, but before he could take the final step out of that nightmare, something made him stop abruptly. The hooded figure appeared before him, as sudden as a shadow forming in the dark. It completely blocked his way, its presence a wall of impenetrable terror. Its eyes glowed with a cold intensity, as if watching him with absolute disdain, and Lucas felt the air around him thicken, becoming even more unbearable, as if the world had closed in around his throat. "You can't escape," said the distorted voice of the figure, its tone unchanging and cold. The words were not just a threat, they were a sentence, a truth that seemed to be etched into the very fabric of reality. "This place will never let you go." The voice dragged on, as if made of ancient, heavy echoes, cutting through the silence of the night with the precision of sharp blades. Lucas tried to move, tried to take a step back, but his legs were heavy, as if the very ground was pulling him down. The words of the figure infiltrated his mind, piercing with the force of a needle, tearing through his thoughts. They were not just vague threats, but terrible promises of an eternity without end. He didn't know how, but he knew that what spoke before him was not human. It was something that transcended anything he could comprehend. No! No! Lucas tried to scream, but his voice failed, buried by the intensity of those words. He felt an icy chill run down his spine, as if the ground beneath his feet were collapsing. The image of the world outside, of freedom, of light, faded, becoming a distant mirage he would never reach. The cemetery, with its tombstones and shadows, now seemed to wrap even tighter around him, as if it had come to life, as if the place itself were becoming a prison of souls. The words of the figure did not cease, now echoing like a mantra, a reminder that he no longer had control, no longer had a choice. You are destined to stay here. The cemetery will never let you go. And as the low, grotesque laughter of the figure blended with the wind, Lucas knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the truth of those words was not a metaphor. He was trapped here, now and forever, and the cemetery, with its dark and omnipresent presence, was his eternal home. Lucas, now consumed by despair, felt his mind fading under the weight of the figure's words. Panic enveloped him like a net, and the vision of escape seemed to disintegrate before his eyes. But in the last remnants of courage, a small spark of will still burned inside him. This would not be how it ended. He could not accept defeat. Not now. With a silent cry of resistance, he leapt to the side, moving quickly, seizing the only opening that had appeared. The cold air sliced across his face like sharp blades as he barely brushed past the hooded figure. It did not move, but the emptiness in its eyes seemed to fixate on him, as if it knew he had no more time. He didn't dare look back. Lucas ran, each step a struggle against his exhausted body, his lungs burning, his body screaming for relief. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The cold, like an unyielding shadow, followed his every move, clinging to him like a living entity, as if the night itself had decided to take revenge. The sensation of ice on his skin was constant, invading his bones, draining his strength, but he kept running, not stopping. The only thing left was that invisible line separating life from death, the cemetery from the city. He heard the figure's laughter, a low and cruel cackle, spreading through the wind, cutting through the air, seeping into his ears like a curse. But he did not dare. Look back. He couldn't. The city was ahead, the streetlights growing closer with each passing second, promising safety, promising an escape from the darkness. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence of the night, a frantic rhythm pounding against his chest, like a war drum. Each movement made him feel the weight of fear on his shoulders, but he didn't falter. The line between life and death was narrowing, and he knew that he could only save himself if he reached the light, the promise of refuge in the city. When he finally crossed the boundaries of the cemetery, his feet touching the safe street, the feeling of relief was almost tangible, as if he had escaped something horrible. But the cold still pursued him, and he felt the weight of the presence watching him from the shadows. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew, deep in his soul, that the cemetery hadn't let him go. It had only freed him for a brief moment, like bait thrown into the sea. He kept running, not stopping, until the city streets swallowed him, and the cemetery, with its secrets and shadows, was left behind. But in his chest, the ice of those words still accompanied him, the certainty that somehow he would never truly be free. When he reached the city, the clock struck 3 times, and the night seemed to finally be over. But something was wrong. The wind still carried the smell of death, and he could swear he felt the eyes of the souls watching him. The feeling of not being alone never left him. The streets were deserted, as if the city had forgotten that dawn had arrived. Windows shut, curtains drawn. No light, no sound, except for the dull echo of his footsteps. He pulled his coat tighter around his body, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to emanate from the ground. He turned the corner and saw something that made him stop. In the center of the street, a figure stood with its back to him, dressed in a long black cloak. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, as if waiting. The man thought about calling out, but his voice refused to come. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a pale, hollow face, like a cracked wax mask. That's when he realized the windows weren't just shut. Behind each pane of glass, dead eyes stared at him unblinkingly. Whole families, frozen, watching silently. The city was alive, but trapped in a cycle of death and constant observation. And now, he was part of it. For days, Lucas couldn't take his eyes off the mirror. His reflection was distorted, as if something from another world had infiltrated his body. He could feel the presence of the souls watching him constantly, waiting for him to return. The mirror showed a face that didn't entirely look like his own. The eyes, once brown and alive, were now darkened, surrounded by deep shadows. There was a slight tremor at the corner of his mouth, an involuntary twitch he couldn't stop, control. When he stepped away, he had the uncomfortable feeling that his reflection took a second longer to do the same. On the third night, he woke to the sound of glass shattering. He rushed to the bathroom and found the mirror cracked, a web of fractures radiating from the center, as if something had struck it forcefully. In the reflection, his image seemed to smile, a crooked, malevolent smile that he knew didn't belong to him. Since then, Lucas has felt that he is no longer alone in his own body. His reflection follows him, even where there shouldn't be mirrors. The shop windows on the street, the blank screens of televisions, even puddles of water. On all of these surfaces, he sees himself, always with that crooked smile, waiting for him to give in. The cemetery, with its silent curse, would never leave him in peace again. The shadows were always there, waiting for the next soul bold enough to enter its domain. And Lucas knew, with a deep sense of foreboding, that he had not truly escaped. Each night, he heard footsteps on the sidewalk outside his house, slow, dragging, as if something lifeless wandered in search of a destination. When he peered out the window, he saw nothing but oppressive darkness, but he knew something was there, something that had come from the cemetery. The walls of his house, once firm and secure, now seemed to pulse as if they were breathing. Whispers came from the corners, indistinct words speaking of pain and loss. The shadows danced on the walls, lurking, growing as the night deepened. One night, Lucas woke to a presence beside his bed, a tall, hooded figure, its face hidden in darkness. He wanted to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The figure pointed at him, then disappeared. The next day, when he returned to the cemetery, he saw his own name carved into a gravestone. It was then that Lucas realized escaping was impossible. The cemetery would not let him leave, because he already belonged to that place. One night, he found himself walking toward the cemetery again, not understanding why. His steps were guided by something he couldn't control. The shadows around him grew denser, and he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Each streetlight flickered and went out as he passed, plunging the street into an ever-deepening darkness. The wind blew cold, carrying with it a low, distant lament, as if ancient voices were whispering his name. When he reached the gates of the cemetery, he saw that they were ajar. He pushed them open reluctantly, and the rusty creak echoed like a suffocated scream. Inside the sacred ground, the gravestones seemed more worn and crooked than he remembered, some covered in a thin layer of moss that resembled dark veins pulsing under the pale moonlight. He stopped in front of a particular grave, his own. The name carved into the stone was stained with something that resembled dried blood. The air grew heavy, and a cold presence approached from behind. Before he could turn around, icy fingers touched his shoulder. A voice whispered in his ear, "You never left." When he reached the gates, the hooded figure appeared once more, now stronger, more powerful. It extended its hand, and Lucas felt his soul being pulled into the darkness. He could no longer fight. The air around him grew dense, heavy, as if the entire cemetery were draining his energy. The voices that had once only murmured were now screaming in his mind, incomprehensible words that seemed to corrode his thoughts. Lucas fell to his knees, feeling his strength drain away like sand slipping through his fingers. The hooded figure leaned down, and Lucas saw a flash of white, empty eyes beneath the hood. The touch of that cold hand on his forehead made his consciousness waver. Dark images filled his mind, decaying bodies emerging from the earth, faces twisted by pain and rage, and the hooded figure reigning over it all. Lucas felt his body being pulled into the darkness, as though he were falling into an endless abyss. In the final moment, a soft, distant voice echoed, "It's not your time yet." He awoke at the edge of the cemetery at dawn, weak and trembling, but he knew it wasn't over. The hooded figure was still waiting for him, and next time perhaps he wouldn't be so lucky. The wind howled around him, the gravestones rising like arms that were waiting for him. The murmurs of the souls had now become a deafening scream. He was back in the place he should have never left. The shadows slithered between the tombs, growing and shaping into distorted figures. Pale faces appeared briefly in the darkness, with empty eyes staring at Lucas without blinking. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the cold, muddy ground, as if the earth itself refused to let him leave. The hooded figure appeared before him, this time not hiding its face. The skin was grayish and stretched tight over the bones, like a body that should never have moved again. A crooked smile formed on the creature's dried lips, and then it spoke, its voice seeming to come from deep within the earth itself. "You've returned, and now you're ours." Lucas felt cold fingers wrapping around his ankles. The skeletal hands of the shadows pulled him down, sinking him into the earth as if he were part of that place. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the wind that echoed through the dark corridors of the cemetery. The last thing he saw was the cadaverous face of the hooded figure, smiling as the cold earth swallowed him whole. The next morning, the townspeople found Lucas's body, thrown into one of the graves. His face was marked with an expression of eternal terror, and his empty eyes reflected the abyss from which he would never return. No one knew how he had ended up there. The footprints in the earth suggested that he had walked alone to the cemetery, but there were no signs of struggle, nor any clue that explained the horror etched into his face. His hands were twisted, as though they had desperately tried to cling to something they could never reach. The older folks in the town exchanged silent glances, aware that this was not the first time something like this had happened. Ancient stories spoke of lost souls that would return to the cemetery and be swallowed by the shadows. Each gravestone told a story of fear and despair, and now Lucas was part of them. That night, some people swore they saw a hooded silhouette walking among the graves. Others claimed to have heard a distant voice calling for help, a voice that seemed to belong to Lucas. And so, the cemetery kept its curse. New rumors spread, more stories about the young man who dared to enter the realm of the dead and never came out. The darkness continued to grow, waiting for its next victim. The townspeople avoided going near the place after dark, and the few times someone dared to venture close, they swore they saw a hooded figure among the tombs. Some said Lucas's voice could still be heard, weakly and desperately calling for help, always getting lost in the cold wind that sliced through the deserted streets. Over time, the fear turned into silence. People began to ignore the cemetery, pretending it didn't exist. But it was still there, watching, lurking, and the hooded figure waited, knowing that there would always be one more curious, naive, or lost soul to drag into the eternal darkness.
Thank you for watching. If this story gave you chills, share it with your friends and bring them to discover the mysteries and terror that surround us. The more people watch, the more incredible stories we can bring to you. Don't forget to watch the video that appears on the screen. It's filled with more surprises and thrills.